Thanks, Annette. It's a pleasure to be here today to talk about what is an absolute passion of mine, inclusion or diversity, which is a way I like to think of it a bit better than inclusion, because we shouldn't just be about inclusion. It should be having a mindset where we begin with, let's have something that's diverse. Let's think diversively. Now, I've got sort of two elements to this presentation today. I want to talk about universal design, which is it was formulated, I guess, for the built environment in architecture. So it's where you see buildings with ramps and rails and the little dots on the ground to help people with disabilities access buildings better. But I've got a hypothesis that we can apply those same principles to sport design and product design to make our sports inclusive for everyone, and it goes beyond disability. It goes into all the underrepresented populations out there. So that's going to be the sort of the core of the presentation. But I thought, just before I get into that, we've got an hour, so my formal presentation, I guess, would take 20 minutes to 30 minutes, and then we've got 30 minutes to have a chat. But feel free to chime in if you feel that it's pertinent to what I'm saying in the actual formal part. But I thought I'd just start off with a speech that I prepared for Kate Palmer, our relatively new CEO at the Sports Commission. Kate's the first female CEO of the Australian Sports Commission, which was, the AIS was founded back in the early 80s, and so it's a great thing for, again, a diverse sporting landscape that the person at the head of the peak body of Australian sport is female. And Kate's really brought a breath of fresh air into the organisation, and with really good thinking. I mean, she's been at Netball Australia for 10 years as CEO, and she's done some amazing things with that sport. So it was the board's decision that they wanted someone from sport to actually run the Sports Commission, which is fantastic. And she's already starting to make really good improvements. So I'm just going to this sets up the universal design presentation, this actual speech, because we thought, when I was having a chat to Kate before she had to deliver this speech about 6 months ago at a similar conference, we thought about how can we make an impact on Australian sport in the area of inclusion and diversity. What are the game changers? What are the priorities? Where can we really have the most impact? And we sort of struggled for a while. I mean, we've got your basic inclusion programs. We can fund sports and say you've got to try and target these populations, but really it has to, and that's usually then given to one person in that sport to be responsible for. We want to get to the point where inclusion is just a part of the fabric of an organisation, and diversity. And what got us thinking about this particular speech was we're currently going through a digital transformation. So you might hear a lot in sport, we need a digital strategy, we need a digital strategy. Well, you can't just plug on a digital strategy to your sport. It has to, again, be permeated into everything you do. So it's how can we incorporate that strategy into everything we do to make the customer experience better. So we thought, well, the same should go for inclusion. You can't just plug, a women in sport strategy in, disability strategy, LGBTI strategies. You can't just plug them in. It actually has to be part of everyone's mindset. And everyone's responsibility in an organisation, not just one person or one department. So that got us thinking. So we projected ourselves forward to 2040 and said, what would we like to see in the year 2040? What would sport look like if we did follow those principles? So I'll just run through this speech. I'll shorten it a bit because, again, we want to have a conversation, but I just thought it was pertinent and really appropriate to set up the Designing to the Edges presentation. So suspend reality for about 10 minutes. I want you to come on a trip with me. I'm going to take you to a journey to 2040, where Australia operates within a diverse, inclusive sporting landscape where there's equal pay, equal media exposure and corporate support for sport where females play, where people with a disability play alongside their able-bodied teammates, where Indigenous coaches win international awards, where umpires are the norm, where pride, multicultural and Indigenous rounds are no longer needed, and transgender participants are no longer excluded. In the early decades of 2000, just look back to where we are now, the sporting spaces in which we interacted with each other were either inclusive or exclusive by design. By designing diverse ways for people to participate. But if you design to the edges of sports populations, we made our sports better for everyone. And I'll touch on that, designing to the edges, what I mean in a short while. We stopped bringing people into what already existed, that stigma where it's, okay, you can come and play with us, but we've got a modified form of sport here for you, come along. Quite condescending, patronising. So we stopped that. We stopped inviting those overlooked groups to join in. We eliminated the stigmatism from the days where people with a disability were told, here's an adapted version of your sport. Instead, it made a new place a better place for everyone because everyone mattered. Sport applied the principles of universality to its program design and looked beyond the average person. There's no such thing as an average or a normal person. It sought out the different, confident that those underrepresented groups had already discovered exactly the solutions the majority of participants were looking for. Sport reframed difference as an opportunity for growth, an opportunity to walk the talk of their values, an opportunity to strengthen their contribution to healthier and happier communities. By recognising and accepting difference, sport started to build empathy for people who interacted with unwelcoming program design and unwelcoming sports every day of their lives. Sports were encouraged to change the design, not change the person. And they came at it from a user-centred perspective or a human-centred perspective. And when sports started to include people in their design processes, those people had a range of abilities and experiences. They discussed new ways and solutions that benefited everyone. So that the sports weren't, so again, we're in 2040, the sports of today, 2040, were built with everyone contributing, not just your average sport punter. In the year 2040, sport now follows the principle in everything it does. It's basically the user-centred design of everything with everyone in mind. By taking this approach and learning about how these groups adapted to the world, sport created better products and programs for everyone. Put more simply, in the year 2040, everyone matters. This user-centred approach and the adoption of universal design have assisted in the implementation of programs and services to ensure accessibility for all, not just those with a disability, but also women, girls, LGBTI, called populations, the elderly, the young. Sport successfully instituted a process of valuing all individuals by designing diverse ways for people to participate. Designing to the edges, we've made our sports better for everyone. Now, we always pride ourselves in Australia that we have a long and shining tradition of pioneering rights and citizen rights. You might not think that in the last 12, 24 months, but we've been a nation of upholding human rights in most cases. And that's sort of translated into sport, as we know, that, fair go, and Aussies always giving their best out on the international stage, fair competition, integrity, etc. In this regard, in Australia, sport has, for the most part, mirrored the values of Australian society. It celebrates our best of our past as well as the lessons from the worst of our past. And so, when you think about it, I think it was Geoffrey Robertson in his book Statute of Liberty, where he talked about a Bill of Rights for Australia and how we should be embracing what we've done well in the past, but also learn from what we've done really poorly in the past. And I think we can do that in sport. Sport reflects that promise to people from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds as well, if we point them out, that they are welcome to play sport. So, as the final part of this speech, and where I'm going to get to, because I do want to focus on transgender in particular, this particular presentation starts with disability because that's where universal design was born, but it takes me a while to get to transgender in this presentation, but you'll see why, because I'm going to set it up and it'll make sense eventually. But let's come back to the now. Let's come back from that idyllic future and land back in 2017. I think I'm preaching to the converted with you guys. It's great to see so many young people in the audience as well, and graduate students, because you are the future of sport. And if we can start building our products, our sporting products and our sporting spaces for everyone, not just that average, then maybe we can get somewhere like that in 2040. So skipping now across to this presentation, I've done this a couple of times, and although, as I said, universal design predominantly began with the built environment for people with disabilities, you can apply the principles across all underrepresented groups. Women called LGBTI, the elderly, even the young, most sports are built for able-bodied males. So a lot of the sports were, began in the 1800s, 1900s, and it was predominantly for men. So just look at AFLW as an example. The women are playing a game that was built for men, but they've got a totally different style of playing. So we need to rethink that. We're trying to retrofit women into what a predominantly male sport's built for, and I'll touch on an example from golf as well. The female game, the women's game, particularly soccer and those team sports, are actually beautiful to watch because they play it differently. And yet we always try and pigeonhole different groups into one sport that has been built for the average. So that's what this presentation is about. Takes about 15 minutes, so I'm happy for you to interject throughout, but we've also got half an hour afterwards, so we can have a good chat about what the concepts I pose here. If you've got anything to add, I'll just grab my notes. All right, so I start off with this presentation. I saw a TED talk, and it was about a guy that was giving a TED talk about the myth of the average. I don't know if you've seen it, but he talks about the myth of the average, particularly as it relates to education. And when I saw it, I thought that could easily be applied to sport. So if you have seen it, I've used elements of that speech in the first 5 minutes of this presentation just to set up the concept of the myth of the average and designing to the edges. So it's 1952 and the US Air Force has a problem. They've got great pilots flying better planes, but they're getting worse results and they don't know why. For a while they blamed the pilots, they blamed the technology, and then they blamed the instructors. But at the end of the day, they got to the bottom of it, and it was actually, the problem was with the cockpit. Oh, thanks. Now, imagine you're a fighter pilot. You're operating a machine that goes faster than the speed of sound, where success and failure, life or death, are measured in milliseconds. Fighter pilots know that their performance fundamentally depends on the fit between them and their cockpit, because after all, what's the use of the best technology in the world if you can't reach the critical instruments when you need them the most? But pilots aren't the same size, so this represented a challenge for the Air Force. The question was, how do you design one cockpit that can fit the most individuals? For a long time, it was assumed that you could do this by designing for the average pilot. Now, intuitively that sounds right, but if you design something that fits the average person, wouldn't it fit the most people? You would think so, but it's actually wrong. And 60 years ago, an Air Force researcher set out to prove to the world just how wrong that was, and this is how he did it. He studied over 4,000 pilots and measured them across 10 dimensions of size. And you can see what those dimensions were there. How many of these pilots would you think would be average on all of those 10 dimensions? Correct. Instead, what he found was that each pilot had what we call a jagged size profile, where they differed on a variety of counts: height, weight, reach. So just because you're the tallest person doesn't mean you're the heaviest. Just because you've got the broadest shoulders doesn't mean you've got the longest torso. It's tricky because every pilot has a jagged size profile, and if you design a cockpit on the average, you've literally designed it for nobody, if you think about that. So the Air Force realised they had a problem, and their response was pretty amazing. They decided to ban the average, meaning that moving forward they refused to buy jets where the cockpit was designed for an average size pilot. And instead they demanded that the companies who built these planes designed them to the edges of dimensions of size. So rather than designing for, say, the average height, they wanted a cockpit that could accommodate as close to the shortest pilot and the tallest pilot as the technology would allow. The companies that made these planes weren't happy. They said that it was going to be impossible, it was going to be too expensive. But once they realised that the Air Force wasn't going to budge, and they weren't, they thought about it and they got down and knuckled down, and they actually did solve the problem. They made great strides. They leveraged simple solutions, and they engaged in a very early form of human-centred design. and came up with something that today we all take for granted. They designed the adjustable seat. So they're in our cars, they're everywhere. That was the solution. It wasn't just one seat for the mythical average pilot. A moving seat that adjusted could fit everyone. And as a result, they have one of the most diverse pilot cohorts of any Air Force in the world. But you've got to wonder how many brilliant pilots would never have fit in a cockpit that was designed for the average. You would have lost all those that amazing talent. So what they did design was a cockpit for everyone, and we keep saying at the Sports Commission, because everyone matters. Everyone matters. We've got to think about everyone, not just that mythical average. So most of us have never sat in the cockpit of a $150 million fighter jet, but we have sat in classrooms and we've played on sporting fields. And one could argue that these are the cockpits of our communities. But we have the same problems. We're spending more money on education and sport, but we're getting arguably worse results in some areas. We're getting less active people out there on sporting fields. So are we doing something wrong? Do we need to think about these principles of universal design? Have we just designed it for the average person who might well be male, Anglo, and strong? So that's what got us thinking. So back to the classroom example, because we're in an education context, I thought I'd give an example from an education perspective. So whether we're talking about declining test results in maths and science or school dropouts, whichever way you want to look at it, a large number of our kids that drop out or lose interest are actually intellectually gifted. And they may be intellectually gifted in areas that don't fit the average, which means we're losing many of our brightest minds to education. So I'm sure education knows they've got a problem, but we tend to blame the students, we blame the teachers, we even blame the parents. But if we can think back to that Air Force example, you can't help but wonder how much of education, the way it's designed, particularly in schools, is just a bad case of design. And this example just shows, are we thinking about everything? Are we designing to the edges when we think about our design? Now, just like the pilots have a jagged size profile, every learner has a jagged learning profile, meaning that they're different on a range of factors. There's strengths, there's weaknesses, and they're on average in some cases. But every single one of them has strengths, and we've got to bring that into the equation when we design things. But again, as the Air Force example has proven, if you design learning environments based on the average, odds are you've designed them for nobody. Because every student has that jagged edged profile, it means that the average actually hurts our best and brightest. And again, you can apply that to sport. We've created learning environments that are designed for the average, so they can't possibly do what we expect them to do, which is nurture individual potential. And in the last few years, education, like the rest of society, has gone digital, and that's given kids a chance that might not be good readers, but very good at maths and science, a chance to excel, because maths and science doesn't first and foremost become a reading exercise. It becomes maths and science because there's new digital ways to harness the brains of those kids. Take, for instance, this TED Talk talks about a kid called Billy, who's gifted in science but below average reader. And as I said, he was struggling, and you can apply this to thousands of children across the world that just never reach their potential because they were written off because they just couldn't get past that first hurdle of reading. But digital technology has allowed children to learn in different ways. So they gave Billy the equivalent of the adjustable seat, and many like him. So how do we get that adjustable seat in the hands of every would-be sports participant? That's the $65,000 question. I think the Air Force example has given us a few ideas on that, which we'll delve into now. I mean, what if we designed to the edges and banned the average in sport? So what do I mean by that? Historically, we've designed sport for the average person with the average needs. I mentioned that before. But average is a barrier to accessibility, and there's no such thing as an average person. Even though market research would like to tell you that we can always break it down to that average person, it can't. There's individuals, and in this day and age we want to include everyone. It's similar to a bell curve. I think a lot of designers design with the 80-20 rule. So you've got your bell curve and the 20% outliers. We'll worry about them later, but we'll design it for that bell curve. It's a similar situation here. But as sport administrators, I think we're failing in our duty to make sport accessible by everyone by focusing on that mythical average that market research tells us. We're still, even in this day and age, we're still designing for the able-bodied person. We're still designing, in a lot of cases, for men, without taking into account age impacts, even your social status and socioeconomic status. A lot of sports you need money to engage in. So again, I'm talking about that too. Can we design sports so that it doesn't matter who you are and you can still play that sport? Sometimes I think sport administrators think that it's okay to design for the average, but it's not. Again, much like our students and our pilots, participants have a jagged performance profile, meaning that they're different on aspects of performance. They're talented at some, not so good at others, and average at others. Now, a lot of our sports have probably been built to the right-hand side there, requiring lots of strength, lots of reaction time, lots of flexibility. We need to take it back to the left a bit, or even in the middle. And again, yes, it says average there, but why don't we design to the averages? The average can be that middle point, but we really need to design to the left, across to the right. At the moment, we're just going down that dotted line with our sports design. If we take an example of a playground, when we design, and this is where I think the problem is, when we design using our own abilities and biases as a starting point, we end up with products that work for us but exclude everybody else. So it really depends on who's designing that product. That's why you need to get as many people into the process of designing a new sport or a new form of a sport as possible. Imagine a playground full of only one kind of swing, a swing that requires you to be a certain height with 2 arms and 2 legs. The only people who'll come to that playground are those that match that design, because the design welcomes them and nobody else. Each feature of the design determines who can interact with that environment and who's going to be left out. So, sport should be seeking out the different, because difference lives at the edges. We should be looking beyond that average, that mythical average, seeking out the people with difference, because they've probably already discovered exactly what it is, or exactly the solutions that the rest of us need. And there's a long line of inventions that prove that. And I'll run through those inventions that have really changed the lives of everyone, but they were invented for underrepresented groups. The typewriter. So the typewriter was invented by the inventor to help a blind friend write legibly. The phone, Alexander Graham Bell, his invention, that came out of many attempts to create technologies to help the deaf and disabled. The drinking straw, again, the inventor's 3-year-old child, he wanted her to be able to drink from the table at dinner time, so he invented the adjustable straw. Email, the guy who invented that, the early form of email, was hard of hearing, and so was his wife, so it was a way that they could communicate to each other. But again, look at how we use it today. These inventions for people with disabilities or for people that are young, elderly, they all help us today because you're thinking to the edges, you're catching those 20% outliers, not just that mythical average 80% bell curve. The OXO vegetable peeler was invented for those with arthritis. We use it every day. The curb cut, that was designed for wheelchairs, but travellers with wheelie bags, women with prams, kids on bikes and skateboards, we all use it today. It's still a curb, but it's the cut that makes the curb accessible. And finally, the air-on chair. Again, that was that was developed out of trying to find out what creates bed sores in people that are in beds for a long time. And so this chair came out of that technology. So you can see, if we think extreme, if we think to the edges, we can actually develop solutions that benefit everyone. I just want to quickly touch on the definition of disability that the World Health Organization put out in 1980, where they said that disability as a personal attribute, in the context of the health experience, a disability is any restriction or lack of ability resulting from an impairment to perform an activity in the manner or within the range considered normal for a human being. Okay, so that was 1980. In 2016, it was context dependent. Disability is not just a health problem, it's a complex phenomenon reflecting the interaction between features of a person's body and features of the society in which he or she lives. So it's moved a bit from there. It's not the fault of the person, it's the fault of the society, it's the fault of how we design society. Disability is not a personal condition, it's mismatched human interactions with the world around us. And so the world around us has to change. If you take that one step further, you could say disability is a design problem. Being elderly is a design person. LGBTI is a design problem. Called, female, being young, they're all design problems. It's not their fault, it's not because they're that, it's because they don't fit into what we've built. So all of these underrepresented populations are victims essentially of a design problem. Now, our abilities change through the day, and when I mentioned those inventions that have been invented for other groups but actually benefit us all, we've got a persona spectrum throughout the day where we have situational disabilities. So it's changing through the days, and there's times when we've actually all felt where we don't fit. For instance, if you're a parent with a sprained wrist and you're reaching for your phone while holding a bag of groceries, in that short moment you share that same experience with someone who has only had one hand their whole life, but we've all experienced it. We've all experienced not being able to fit and mismatches between us and the environment. So we can have that empathy where we sort of know what other people are feeling, which is good because we need to have that empathy. And that's where some of the greatest inventions, some of the greatest thinking has come from that kind of experience. So we need to reframe difference as an opportunity, not something that's just a hassle that we have to tack on to our existing sports just to make sure that those people can play our sports. It's actually an opportunity. And by recognising the difference, we can start to build empathy for people who interact with unwelcoming designs every day of their lives. And we need to include those people in our design processes because they're the ones that can tell us. And it's a co-design situation where now when we sit down with sports and we talk about how do we get more people playing that sport, well, okay, let's think of your sport, but let's change it a bit. Let's make it a bit more accessible to everyone. And it's not a modified sport, it's another product. And I guess examples like AFL 9s and what's another one? Netball has fast fives, hot shots in tennis. They're all examples of where they actually got the users in, and they could be children, they could be elderly, they could be LGBTI women. They got them in and they helped co-design that process from the bottom up. They still didn't lose the principles of the game that everyone so loves, but they just widened it so that everyone could play and didn't feel stigmatised because it was actually a mainstream sport. So again, it's building empathy for those who interact with those designs every day of their life. So here we get to the definition of universal design. It's the design and composition of an environment so that it can be accessed, understood and used to the greatest extent possible by all people. So if you think back to that example I gave of a built environment with the ramps and the railings and the no stairs, that's where it began. So that's sort of where this definition comes from. But basically I like to think of it as the human-centred design of everything with everyone in mind. So it's the design of everything with everyone in mind. And by taking a user-centred design approach and learning about how these groups adapt to the world, we can create better products for everyone because everyone matters. So this is where I just want to get into an example of golf. So you can see I've given a lot of examples about disability, but this is one that probably impacts on women and juniors and elderly golfers. So golf's my sport, so that's why I can relate to it. So back many moons ago, I got down to a scratch handicap. I was early 20s and I loved the game of golf. And I used to go out and play with some guys from my local golf club. We'd go out and they were also pretty good golfers off scratch. And I don't know how many of you play golf here, but I'll do a quick little sort of 5-second example of what golf is, so of what the tees in golf refer to. So the black dot up there is usually where the men's championship tee is. You know, the big boys hit from there. They've got the power. That's where they hit. Now, usually the women's tee, so they call it a women's tee, so the men's is blue or black, the women's is a nice pretty red colour. Usually it's put probably, I'm being generous here, it's usually just tacked on after the men's tee. So what I found throughout my whole golfing career when I played with the guys was we could equally hit an amazing drive on a par 4. The boys would be hitting in with a 9-iron, and for those that don't play golf, 9-iron is a pretty easy shot to hit because you're closer to the green. Whereas I would have nailed my drive just as well, and granted I'm not as strong necessarily as these big guys were. I'd still hit an almost perfect drive, but I'd be hitting him with a 4-iron. And that was fine because I had got to a level where, you know, I had a pretty good chance of still getting on the green by hitting a 4-iron, but the boys probably had a 95% chance of hitting the green. I probably had a 70% chance of hitting the green. Now that was me as a pretty good golfer. Think of your average junior or elderly player or lady or woman who plays golf. They don't necessarily have that strength or that speed of swing that the scratch markers have, and so they're hitting on with driver 3-wood or driver sometimes, and it just gets plain difficult for those people and the elderly and even juniors. But what some savvy golf courses are doing now is they're applying universal design techniques to golf courses. So they've rid their tees of men's, women's, senior tees, and there are a lot of clubs that have seniors tees that are yellow for the elderly. And again, they're tacked on just past the women's red tees. Now they're having up to 5 different colours at the tee box. And the tees don't have to be all together right up near that black one. They're actually spread down the course. So essentially, you want everyone hitting on a particular 4, you want everyone hitting in with a 9-iron, having the chance to hit in with a 9-iron, because then they can have a better chance of getting that elusive par or birdie. So they've done some research, and they've got a whole lot of people. They've got juniors, elderly, women and men in, and they've worked out, okay, so if we were this particular short par 4, if we want everyone to hit in with a 9-iron, let's work back from the green. Where does the tee box have to be? So if someone hits a really amazing first shot, they should be rewarded. They should all be able to hit in with a 9-iron. So it's bringing it back, it's bringing everyone in and allowing everyone to have that same opportunity of a good score. So they have the tees scattered down the fairway, and you can choose whichever tee you want to hit off on any given day. So essentially there's 4 colours there. You've got 4 different courses, golf courses on one golf course. You might feel good one day and you might want to hit off the black tee. Another day you might want to challenge yourself to hitting shorter irons to hone your short game. So you choose to hit off the red one down at the front. It's making it available for everyone. So, and Alistair Mackenzie, world's famous golf course architect from early 1900s, he designed a lot of the amazing courses in the world today. One of the quotes he said, "The ideal hole is surely one that affords the greatest pleasure to the greatest number." And if you go back to that universal design definition, universal design is the design and composition of environments so that it can be accessed, understood and used to the greatest extent possible by all people. It's very similar. And he was around in the early 1900s. He got it. It might not have translated into the tee boxes when he was around, but that was the club's decision to do that. But he actually designed courses that challenged everyone, wherever you were on the course. There were challenges, there were bunkers to get over, but there was reward for good shots. A lot of the time when seniors and women and juniors play, there's no reward for good shots because they're playing on what is essentially a powerful man's golf course. So there is some really good steps being made there in golf. Those courses that have embraced that kind of universal design, they've seen participation increase, they've seen speed of play increase because those players aren't getting into as much trouble, they're not going to the trees, which takes time to find the ball. It's family focused. Seniors can play well into their 90s. They don't have to struggle off those long tees. And there's more mixed events, so it's been really good. I mean, it's going to be a slow burn in golf because golf's a very traditional sport. But I've just come from Adelaide where the Australian Women's Open is being played, and Golf Australia have just launched a new women and girls golf strategy, and this is part of it. This kind of cultural change in golf clubs around Australia. It's like we've dropped. So women's participation since 1973 has gone from 35% down to 20%. Now that's scary because golf's a pretty big sport, and if we've seen such a big drop in 30 years, 40 years of that magnitude, something's got to be done. Something's going wrong, and something's got to be done. In a lot of cases, going into a golf club is a very unfriendly, unwelcoming environment, and it's built for very strong people. So let's try and include everyone by universally designing our sports. It's important to say universal design is not bringing people into what already exists. It's making a new space for everyone, a better space for everyone, because everyone matters. Now, you might wonder what's this got to do with transgender. So I'm going to just give you a bit of an update on what we're doing, and it briefly alluded to it, and how does transgender fit with universal design. It is a topical subject at the moment. We've got Hannah Mounsey who attempted to play in AFL Women's and was knocked back. And then more recently the AFL have said that she can play in the ACT or VFL comps. How that works I'm not sure, because you would think that the strength of the women at the top league, there's probably more chance of less injury happening than if it happened at a community level, but that's what the AFL have decided. But, and this is where you've really got to sort of see where transgender participation is moving. The ISC consensus and Catherine, you're probably well across this, I think it was 2003, the early one, where they said that to compete at the Olympics you had to be going through hormone therapy, but you had to have surgical procedure as well. Anyway, 2015 they dropped the surgical intervention. They've cut that out, and rightly so, because it's a gross violation of human rights to tell someone they have to do that in order to compete. And it was predominantly then based on a certain limit of testosterone, 10 nanomole in the body, and you have to have changed your identity for 4 years, I think it might be, and have been on hormone therapy for at least 12 months before you can compete. They're looking at that again, and they're coming out with a new guideline after Pyeongchang, and we're not quite sure what it's going to be. We think it's probably going to make the hormone limit much harder for a transgender woman to fall within. So it's actually not helping transgender athletes. But it's an interesting area of discussion, because there just isn't enough science yet to prove one way or the other and we'll talk about transgender females, because the ISC don't have much to say on transgender males, which is originally someone who was born with female sexual features that has then made the transition to male. They don't see that as a threat, but the other way around they do, because there's a lot of thinking out there that even if you've gone on hormone therapy, there's going to be an unfair advantage that transgender female has on the sporting field. But there's no real research yet that proves that that's the case. In fact, there's a lot of research that proves that it's not the case, particularly in a lot of sports. Heavy contact sports such as AFL, the jury's still out, because a transgender woman can get her hormone levels down under the limit, but because she lived most of her life as a man, and through puberty she developed broad shoulders and bigger bone structure, which you cannot reverse, but you can reverse a lot of other things: strength, power, and a host of other things, stamina, etc. But you can't ever really reverse that frame that was built through puberty and testosterone, etc. So in contact sports, that's why the AFL has struggled so much with this. But other sports, you know, in Olympic sports, you've got class sports like boxing and wrestling and taekwondo where you're in weight classes. So there is there's no reason in my mind and a lot of people's mind that a transgender woman should not be able. Why can't she compete as long as she comes within the weight range and she's abided by the IOC's regulations? There's no real science that has said that she has an unfair advantage. And when you think about Usain Bolt and Michael Phelps, they're superhuman. They go beyond the spectrum of male, of normal male. But when a female is beyond the spectrum of a normal female, then she's called a cheat or unfair advantage. And so you see these variations in sport anyway. But sport is so binary. You have female, male, and nothing in between. But I'm not sure of the statistics, but it's 1% possibly, or even greater, of the intersex athletes that fit in between, that are born with certain characteristics but identify as another sex or identify as the sex that they thought they were, but then Olympic administrators are saying you're a man because you've got more testosterone than the average woman, and when they used to sex verification tests, which were absolutely onerous back up until the early 2000s, was still happening. So someone, could be born and think that they're a female, and they essentially are a female. They identify as a female, but then someone without any experience parades them in front of them and says, "No, you're a man." So there's some really, really horrific things that have happened in the past. And so when I mentioned binary sport, we've got to try and think, well, maybe in 2040, in that year 2040, maybe we're playing sports that aren't categorised as male and female necessarily, but they're based on skill. They're based on the jagged performance profile. And you can still watch the greatest and best AFL players compete, but there might be some women in there. And then the next grade down, you might have mixtures of men and women because they fall within. I don't know how sport's going to deal with it, but it's not as clean cut as male and female, and science is showing that. And there's more and more transgender people that are feeling more and more comfortable playing sport that want a fair go. And so it's raising all these questions, and we get a lot of queries from sports saying, what are we going to do, what are we going to do? And there's some pretty straightforward human rights guidelines in Victoria and ACT that say you should allow at community level, whatever the athlete or participant identifies with, you let them play in that competition. When it gets to elite level, that's when the national sporting organisations cop out and say, oh, well, we've got to abide by the IOC's regulations, which arguably are not really as current as they probably should be. So universal design, I think, applies in that case. Is let's not just think binary male, female, you've got to fit into female, you've got to fit into male. Universal design can possibly be, we can design products where everyone can play, and it doesn't matter if you're male or female. That's my hope, but how we're going to get there is the next question, because there's duty of care. There's duty of care for cisgender women, particularly with the AFL, and if can you imagine if a cisgender woman got injured in AFLW and it was Hannah that happened to bump her, all hell would break loose. But if it was another cisgender woman who did it, be fine. And we've got Liz Cambridge competing against small girls in basketball. We've got Shane Mumford playing against Eddie Betts, but no one raises an eyebrow there. There's massive differences in size and strength, but it's okay because they're men and they're women. But you start to blur those lines and suddenly you're excluded from our sport because you don't fit into what we classify as male or female. Well, let's make our sports more than that. Let's universally design our sports so that we're not, in a lot of cases, it doesn't matter if you're male or female, you can play. So, after all that, happy to open up and have a chat, and it doesn't necessarily have to be about transgender, any of the elements that I've raised or principles that I've raised, happy to have a chat. But yeah, we're actually about to embark on a roundtable consultation process with the Human Rights Commission on transgender. We're going to get a lot of transgender advocates in the room, athletes, players associations, doctors and human rights lawyers together to try and work this out. And again, it won't be a hard and fast policy. It's going to be guidelines that sports can work to, and it's always going to have to be a case-by-case basis, because as I said, there's high-impact sports, there's sports with classes like boxing, and then there's individual sports like swimming. And in fact, a major sport is about to come out with a new policy where they're saying anyone, if they identify as a certain gender, they are allowed to compete in a female category at the national championships. And they don't even have to have gone through hormone treatment. Again, it's not a contact sport, it's an individual sport. Obviously, if they win the nationals, they can't go to the Olympics because they'll be knocked out by the IOC guidelines that say they have to have gone through hormone therapy. But this sport, and it's a major, iconic Australian sport, want to allow anyone, no matter how they identify, to compete in the category that they identify with, which is a pretty big step. So